Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the museum on a kind of blustery and winter-like November afternoon. I'm John Holler, the CEO, and it's just a pleasure to welcome all of you here today for what is the concluding event in what has been quite a momentous year this year for us, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the integrated circuit, the sonic boom that not only echoed throughout this part of the country, but changed the world and gave rise, of course, to Silicon Valley and so much more. We've had events beginning in January with Richard Tedlow from the Harvard Business School, 2 great nights in May celebrating the prehistory and history of the IC, and so many other events like this, and I hope you've had a chance to make many of them, if not all of them. This is going to be quite a day because we have a great panel discussing the microprocessor wars, that thing that went from the data sheet, which collectively cost about $100,000 to distribute, all the way up to advertising in the Super Bowl. How did that happen? Why did it happen? Who made it happen? The people who can tell that story today are here with us, and it's going to be a very entertaining hour. Please go ahead and enjoy your lunch, and also please note there are evaluation forms too that we would like for you to fill out for this event at the end. And it's my pleasure now to introduce someone who was very involved in the microprocessor wars himself and is going to act as our moderator today, David Laws, who's one of our great volunteers here at the museum, former executive at AMD, among other things, and David's going to conduct the panel today. David, come on up.
Thank you, John. Okay, welcome to the Microprocessor Wars. The chart that I have up here behind me, I don't expect you're going to read very much of it. The whole point is to give you some idea of the breadth, depth, and complexity of these wars that raged across the valley and across the world over a 30 or more year period, and I guess they are still going on. If you're really interested in the detail of that, there is a copy of the poster over in the corner that I recommend you take a look at. And if you really like it, there's a sale today in the museum gift shop, $2 a piece. And looking at it, you know, if it doesn't fit your decor, you could always buy it as a gift wrap for your favorite nerd at that price. So, the panel today includes representatives of 2 of the most influential vendors in shaping the long-term direction of the business, both from architecture and marketing perspectives. And they all participated in 3 phases, and could I have the next slide, please, of what we are describing here as the marketing wars. Beginning back in 1971, when Intel introduced their first microprocessor, the techniques that were used in marketing sort of continued what had been going on for almost 30 years, since radio vacuum tubes were introduced in the 1930s. It was price, delivery, and 1 or 2 specs that you could meet. And a couple of tickets for the ball game probably helped get a design win as well during that period of time. The microprocessors picked up the same kind of style of marketing, but quickly evolved into far more sophisticated kinds of tools to keep abreast of the competition. Specifically things like development tools, field applications engineers, and discussions of architecture and how they're going to serve the application best. The second phase of the microprocessor wars, which we have up here, which we called MPU2, addressed the total solution for the customer. And for that to succeed, selling had to move upscale to the vice presidents of engineering and the executive suite. These were bet your company kinds of decisions, and involved a very different approach to marketing microprocessors. And then there's a third phase that came in towards the end of the 1980s, I guess, which we're calling consumer as being the target audience. And this was an era of branding where you differentiated yourself in the eye of the customer, the end customer, and tried to persuade them to put pressure on the vendors to use your processor. So with that background, I'd quickly like to ask the panel to introduce themselves. The combined experience expands all three phases of the microprocessor marketing wars, and their detailed biographies are published on the museum website. So I won't ask them to go into a lot of detail of that, just give some idea of when they were involved with the microprocessors and the company they worked with. Dave, you give us, you were first in the business.
Right,
and you start out here.
I joined Intel in February of '74, 3 months before we introduced the 8080. I've been designing mini computers and digital systems with TTL before that. And I took over marketing of microprocessors in '68 and then was general manager of the microprocessor business from 1978 until 1991, with the exception of 1982, where I ran development systems. And then managed marketing, corporate marketing and applications, architecture for the next year, and then ran corporate strategy for a couple of years. And then my last 2 years at Intel, in 1995 and 96, I was in charge of the server business. And so I was, the last 13 years, reported to Andy Grove on the executive staff, so sort of represented the management side of this team.
Thank you, Dave. Might as well go in order of seating up here. Claude,
Claude,
how were you involved?
I joined Intel in 1982. My first product line were the 8086 and 8088 processors with a whole complement of chips. In '83, I took over the 286 and 386 product lines. Then later on, '87 through '89, I was director of marketing for all the microprocessors at Intel. I then was general manager of our RISC products, joined corporate marketing again later on, and then ultimately joined the dark side and became a venture capitalist.
Thank you. Melissa?
I joined Intel in 1978 and ultimately became the senior worldwide marketing communication manager for 7 business units, and that included the 186, 286, 386 et al., and that's why I'm here.
Jack, this must be a familiar situation for you, being surrounded by Intel. Why don't you tell us about your background?
Yeah, except this time we get to tell stories of what each other were thinking. So, and it's the truth rather than what we were saying. So, I joined Motorola in 1978. I was an application engineer a year before we brought out 5 generations of new architectures, or 5 new architectures. 68,000 was one of those. In March of '81, I became the marketing manager. And I stayed in the business as the marketing guy till 1990. I ran a business unit for a couple of years as we were setting up SOCs, and then I went back to run marketing until '92. And then I finished my last 5 years at Motorola. I was running various parts of the sales force, calling on the computer accounts and other strategic accounts.
Thank you, Jack. So we'd like to try to go through the topics here in a roughly chronological manner. So I will ask the speakers to talk about their experience in that period. Dave, you entered the microprocessor battlefield just as Intel was preparing to introduce the 8080. Can you give us an overview of the competitive scene in this first phase of the MPU marketing wars? What were the key marketing weapons? Who are your competitors?
Well, when we introduced the microprocessor, really the competitor was TTL, and TI had won that war with the 7400 series, and the standard marketing material were data sheets. And I remember designing, when I was at Microdata, the machine that's down in visible storage, the 3200, with TTL, and my data catalog got very ragged, tagged. And so when we were introducing the 8080, the data sheet got a lot of attention. But we realized from our sales force that we really needed more, and that really began the hiring of application engineers in the field, the writing of more application notes, and then peripheral circuits obviously followed, and then single board computers and sim boards and development systems and in-circuit emulators followed as we basically changed the way we presented from the TTL style to what became the microprocessor style.
And who were the biggest competitors for you at the time, Dave?
Well, it was very soon that it was Zilog, and after the 8080, the Z80 came out, and basically if I could use a marketing term, the Z80 kicked our butts, and was clearly a winning product. In fact, that became a theme that continued through this first stage of the Z80 was better, the 6800 was better, the 68000 was better, the 68020 was better. It wasn't really until the 386 that we had a competitive product. And so during this period, it became important that we were going to lose that war. So we better change the war. And so let's start making this about solution. Let's start making this about development systems, in-circuit emulators, et cetera, et cetera. So we had to change the war because we were losing the processor war.
Jack, when you joined Motorola, these wars had been raging for several years. The company had been extraordinarily successful, as Dave points out, with the 6800, and you were about to introduce the 68000. How did the marketing strategy for this new generation that was coming along change based on that experience?
Well, I guess to back up just to the beginning of your question, the time frame at the beginning of the question, so the first volume opportunity that Motorola was most successful in was a trip computer from Cadillac. And then we ended up a few years later in engine control with 4 chips going into 6 million cars a year. And that was right about at the time as we launched the 68,000. So our business had become a couple $100 million. We'd gone from being a loss leader business in an outpost that no one knew of to a very profitable company, a very profitable business unit. And we wanted to make sure that we positioned the 68,000 very differently than the rest of the business. We didn't want to cannibalize it. And so we really aimed very, very high. We positioned ourselves that it was a 32-bit computer on a chip. And so that kind of set our initial positioning. As we looked at the challengers in the marketplace, Intel was clearly the dominant competitor that Motorola had. Zilog, as you said, had a better architecture, earlier entry than the 68,000, still had some segmentation issues. National had a whole family of products that were coming out. And then later in the time frames we're talking about today, Fairchild Clipper started leading off as one of the first RISC architectures that made some traction.
A lot of challenges there.
A lot of challenge. AMD 29,000.
AMD 29,000, that's true.
Yeah.
So Claude, by the time you arrived at Intel in 1982, the company had won the IBM business. As that decision set the stage for much of the future of the industry, as some observers might contend that the marketing wars were all over. What was left for you to do?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this all night. I can't remember. See, the thing is, in 1982, the microprocessor business at Intel was about a $100 million business. Out of that, what we at the time called office automation was about 20 to 25 million, approximately a quarter. There was no such thing as the PC business. So we really didn't think about what this IBM design was going to turn into. We fundamentally had no clue. At the same time, to kind of amplify what Dave said earlier, we had just announced 2 products, the 186 and the 286, which in their own ways had some fairly major flaws. The 186 was not compatible with a PC. It was not compatible with MS-DOS because it had different peripherals. And the 286 had the absolutely most convoluted architecture mankind has ever seen. I remember trying to explain to a room of 300 engineers in Edison, New Jersey, why they really wanted 16 bits and call gates instead of a 68010 with a flat address space. I think I could still do it, but I couldn't do it without laughing anymore. This was unbelievable. So our issue, oh, and by the way, the guys we were up against were Motorola. We also were very afraid of NEC. NEC had started first by copying the 8086, but then creating their V series, which had merits in and of themselves. The Japanese customers were very interested in that, so we were very worried about those 2 companies. At the end of the day, the design that mattered the most was the PC AT. It was because in the previous generation, Zilog Z80 and the 6502 from MOSTEC had been the engines of the office automation machines. 8088 was ours, but the fear was the next generation, the third one, was going to go to somebody else. And the key was the PCAT. Getting IBM to select the 286 was sort of the watershed that said, okay, now we have established this notion of software compatibility. And that notion stayed with us. I guess it's still with us today.
So Melissa, you were at Intel for about 10 years during some of the most exciting days of these wars. The battles started off with skirmishes at the engineer's bench and ended up with global battles for the hearts and minds of the consumer's pocketbook. PR communications must have evolved dramatically during that period of time. Can you give us a thumbnail sketch of what you saw during your career?
We became much more effective and efficient with our advertising and PR. We also took, from a public relations perspective, we stopped just doing press releases and started doing all the other elements that fall within the umbrella of public relations. Interviews with key luminaries, press release packets. We started taking the executives out on international press tours, and we started hosting Intel-sponsored seminars. All of the PR and ad plans in 1983, 84, we started to link and coordinate key corporate umbrella messages over all of them. In the advertising arena, we went from spec sheet directed one-page ads to very elaborate, well-structured advertising campaigns. And the language in those ads evolved as well as we started to address our audience, which was engineers, engineering management, and ultimately management. We started to talk to them as human beings and address the emotional issues that every human being has as well. The biggest ad campaigns that we had, the first one would have been the introduction of the 186, the 286, which was a 5-page ad, which had to go all the way to Davidow for approval because product marketing wanted to keep it separate ads, and then followed by our silver bullet, the 386. So we evolved into, I think, Intel really understanding the value of advertising and public relations, and that became the battleground since we really couldn't win it on the specs of our microprocessors.
A lot of admissions coming out on this tape. I'm glad we're catching this on tape back there. So,
at the time, Bill Davidow had a stack of foils that were entitled "Selling a Dog," and basically the simple message was, "You got to sell what you got," okay? And I guess we did.
I presume that was not presented to customers, that presentation.
Presumably not.
It had a different cover page than what the customer.
So Dave, you talked about this transition to selling the dog, I guess is a phrase I just learned, which I like. How did you begin to address senior management? I mean, did you get access to the CEO every time you wanted to see him? And what was the...
It started in what I think were the dark ages of Intel, and that's 1980. And remember back in 76, the Z80 was introduced. It kicked butt, marketing term, the 8080 and 8085, and the Z80 far outsold the 8085. So in 78, we introduced the 8086, and in 1978, and in 79, the 68,000 and the Z8000 were both introduced. And engineers loved it. Mainly software engineers loved them because they had 32-bit linear addresses. We would win at the engineering level, the design engineer, the hardware engineer, because of our in-circuit emulators and all our support chips, et cetera, and our application engineers that go in and do the design for them. But when it came to the software department says, no way are we using that product. And the software engineers were winning. And Bill Davidow in 1980 pulled together Jim Lally, who was running development systems, and me, I was running microprocessors, and said, we've got to crush the competition. And we got together in an offsite meeting with Regis McKenna and a few other people, and formulated what became Operation Crush. Legal later made us change the name from Crush. We're not allowed to crush competition. That was too harsh. But the presentation that Bill Davidow gave to kick off that meeting was called Selling the Dog. And basically he said, here's the problem. You know, we're number 3 in a 3-man race, quickly going to 4 with National coming out soon. We're at the bottom of the list, and we need to change the way that we sell. And so we, over a series of meetings, formulated basically a different selling strategy. And what we said is we've got to get above the software engineer. We've got to get to the VP of engineering, the manager of engineering. And we've got to tell a story that's compelling to him. And we also have to take a story to the executive office. And the story really is that this is a bet your company decision. The microprocessor you choose is a bet your company decision. It's not about, you know, you can't trust that to your software engineer, your hardware engineer. You, the CEO, need to be involved in talking to the VP of engineering. And the whole effort was to change the decision making up the level because we were losing.
So Intel was losing, and all of a sudden Project Crush comes along, Jack. Were you aware of this?
Oh,
and how quickly and how did you respond?
Well, what do the customers do? You know? Dave's there, and then they call us, and it's, well, what are you guys going to do about this? Particularly our customers, the end customers pushing back on things. So I guess we've been pretty well focused on management at the customers. We had proliferated, let's say, on the order of 500 to 1,000 designs. We had Apollo, we had Sun as startups in the workstation business.
You were winning everybody.
We had HP, and we were around talking to these people quarterly on roadmaps, on negotiations. But the challenge was, you know, how are we going to get to the end customers, and how are we going to get to the right level of executives? And we took a couple of technical guys who could present pretty well, and we promoted them to vice president, and we put one guy over in Europe, and we put one guy over in Asia. And so we at least had, you know, we had existing relationships at the executive levels through our worldwide organization, and then we got domain knowledge to where we could use it very often instead of it being a trip from headquarters to cover it. So we tried to scale up. We tried, we had an informal name called Orange Crush since I was from Texas, and University of Texas was orange, but and it was a soda. So we were trying to counter, and we were on a much smaller budget. So it was a lot more, I was reading a lot of books on guerrilla warfare, guerrilla marketing, and trying to figure out, you know, what can you do at a different scale that can be disruptive.
At this point, was Zilog still a contender, or had they fallen by the way with the Z8000?
Zilog had kind of fallen by the way, but National had done a very good job with the 32,000 and the 16,000, and their story was, hey, the software is both upward and downward compatible. The rest of us, it was, you're all upward compatible, and if you write something on the latest machine, it's harder to retrofit it on the earlier.
Yeah, we recently did an oral history panel on the 32,000 with the National team, and it was quite interesting to hear the great technical achievements that they had made. But they didn't realize quickly enough the importance of going to top management. They talked about having won the designs at all the VPs of engineering level in Burroughs, and Gordon Moore went into the CEO of Burroughs, and the design disappeared overnight.
Yeah, that's what anytime we were losing, we would send an executive in.
And so we had to preemptively do that so that we could have been there first and at least get a call to respond.
I guess those are the days when United Airlines was making a profit too, with all you guys flying around the world.
And that, it was actually okay to fly.
Yeah.
So Claude, for which of the processes in this phase 2 was selling to top management most critical to success? Was there a point where this really made the difference?
Yeah, I think we really focused aggressively on top management in the 84, 85 timeframe in the 32-bit wars, and that corresponds with 386. not only were we up against Motorola and National, who obviously had great products out there, but we were actually dead last to market. We were 7th to market with a 32-bit processor, behind companies that have disappeared, like AT&T and Hitachi, or disappeared from that business, I should say. So we were dead last. Oh, and we had our architecture that was compatible with a previous contraption called the 286. So the thinking was, well, we were losing everywhere, as Dave said. And the thinking was, if this decision stays with the engineers, we're going to lose every time. We're late, and they hate programming our stuff. Oh, and as a historical reference, the first 32-bit Windows came out 10 years after the launch of the 386. So we had to hold the fort for a while. Whereas these guys were selling Unix, so that was, you know, they had an operating system.
They had
they had the Mac.
real operating system.
So we were selling, you know, it's going to be terrific. Don't worry about it. So when we pushed it out, when we pushed out the 386 in 85, as I said, we were 7th to market. We were dead last. We blew all the marketing budget ever assembled at Intel. Historically, in the days of the 8088, a marketing campaign, advertising campaign was $125,000. That included ad development and 6 insertions in electronics, EDN, you know, the trades. For the 386, I went to Seagrove and I said, I want to run an ad in the Wall Street Journal. So first reaction was, nobody reads the journal except accountants. and then how much is it going to be? $70,000 for one day. So I was sent packing, come back with data. Well, long story short, he finally said yes. First time we ran an ad in this publication targeting a totally different audience, not the electronics EDN reader, but the CEOs and what we call today CXOs. I think that was really a turning point in the whole approach to how we were selling these products.
So Melissa, what were the different messages that you are now having to present via your PR channels?
With the 386, before we even announced the 386, we did our most elaborate ad ever, and it was the religious ad. It was 8 pages long, and we actually guaranteed management of the hereafter. We actually said 486, and we hadn't even introduced the 386. But this was the ad where we talked to software compatibility, the complete solution, you know, guaranteed of the hereafter. We really started using the silver bullet approach. We did worldwide launch, maximum visibility. We really involved corporate management. We, from a PR perspective, we announced this product at the De Young Museum and simultaneously in Europe and Japan, and the rest of our advertising went dark, which meant we took everything down, so all eyes were focused on the 386. And then the 386 ad followed in October. And it was the hardest sell to get management to buy into.
Management.
And to grow. We had to go and show the cost per insert, and that actually upper corporate management read the Wall Street Journal. And it was, I mean, there were emails, not emails, but memos flying back and forth. And finally, lots of them, finally he relented. And that was absolutely phenomenal to start talking to upper management about their investment going forward.
I think the titles were interesting. You could probably state them better than I can.
I do have.
Remember that choosing a microprocessor as a religious experience, I think, was the first of the 8 pages.
Yes.
And then it went on.
I forget the second.
You want your software to live forever. I mean, it was
You want to be guaranteed of the hereafter. You want to be part of the great plan. And it was page after page, and it was really impactful.
And then I think the title on the 386 launch, do you have that?
I have that here, I do. That was my favorite. It was a very simple 3-page ad, and the cover,
that ran in the Wall Street Journal.
the headline on the lead tease page was, by September 30th, 1985, 30 major corporations had already committed $75 million to a 32-bit processor that didn't exist. You turn the page, it was worth the wait. Simple, direct, to the point. And
to the management.
Yes, and to management. And it was very, very successful.
Well, the other bit is, as I said earlier, we were dead last to market. So the thought was, okay, let's address that issue up front. And interestingly enough, in the PR conversations afterwards, it never came up. We were never written up as being late and being out there at last, just because we hit that thing so hard up front, and I guess it worked.
Well, you guys are doing that, and John Scully calls Bob Galvin, and he's going, Apple's getting killed over this stuff. What are you guys going to do about it? And so I get this phone call, and it says, why don't you come out and meet Andy Cunningham and Regis McKenna? And Regis thoughtfully shares similar ideas, and so now armed with equal weapons, we're trying to go off and do advertising in the Wall Street Journal, Business Week. I was actually the first guy in any business unit inside Motorola that got to talk with the financial community as we changed this to RISC, and how do you reduce the financial risk for the company by making the safe choice. So,
fascinating changes in the business.
major changes.
There will be a point when we'll be entertaining questions from the audience, and there are cards on your desk. So if questions come up along the way you'd like to ask, please fill those cards out, and someone from the museum will come around and collect them shortly. So now we're sort of halfway through this second phase, selling to management, and some game changes come along. One of them was Intel's decision to sole source the 386, presented a major shift in marketing strategy. Dave, how did this impact the way you went to market, and how did you handle that with customers?
Actually, thanks to the great impact of the 386 introduction, and it had a linear 32-bit address, the job became quite easy. There was a big demand for the product, and we had ramped up production technology. Jerry Parker and Craig Barrett had done an excellent job of building capacity. And so we simply went to the customer. We didn't do anything from a sales and marketing standpoint, advertising standpoint, but when customers brought up the objection of who's your second source on the 386, we said, we are. We're going to make it in this fab, and we're going to make it in that fab. We're going to assemble it in that plant. We're going to assemble it also in this plant. We're going to test it in that plant. And we're also going to test. So everything, we've got parallel paths. You've got assurance of supply. It won't be a problem. Of course, second sourcing was always explained to us by the buyers is we need it for security of supply, but it was, we really knew this deep dark secret was, it was to get lower prices. And so the buyers weren't particularly happy with that answer, because it didn't give them what they wanted, and it kind of took away one of their weapons in enforcing second sourcing. But what we realized is that it wasn't the purchasing people in control anymore. The engineering organization had far more power than the purchasing department in terms of which microprocessor to use. And we had now moved that up the chain so that the VP of engineering saw that as a critical part of his job, and the CEO was very intensely involved. So the sole sourcing of the 386 turned out to be not an issue.
So Jack, another major change during that period was the advent of RISC as a competitive architecture. And at what point did this begin to become a factor in your marketing strategy at Motorola? And were there battles within the company about how to respond?
Oh, there were huge battles. RISC had started showing up on the scene by the mid-'80s. We'd brought in a new architect to give us another team, and you know, with a new architect, it's always easier to create a new architecture than it is to create another product, and that's not entirely fair. But so we had this big debate of, hey, with the clean slate and knowing the things I ought to know, and using Harvard architecture to give me more bandwidth, I can get a lot more performance out of these machines. And at the same time, we had a business that was, you know, double-digit profits on several $100 million. We had a lot of customers in production. I remember going and talking to the customers, and they're going, you know, which one do I choose, Jack? You know, which one is really going to give me the most performance? Which one are you going to invest in? Well, I'm going to invest in both of them, and we're going to see how it plays out. And they look at you for a minute and they go, okay, right. Now, which one are you really going to invest in? When you got one less dollar than you need for both of them, who wins the jump ball? And that was a tough choice. And it was a big choice inside Motorola because Motorola had dreams and desires to be a significant player in the computer business, and this was the time frame of vertical integration still. So it was how do we scale this business up? So it was, it ended up being a lot of arguments till April of 1988 when we introduced the 88,000. So.
Who were the other competitors in the RISC area?
And, well, I'd already mentioned Fairchild Clipper. Spark had been in the marketplace. MIPS was coming to market. There were interesting opportunities for us to even bid to be an ASIC supplier supplying Spark at the same time. So it was kind of interesting to be in a business with your own architecture. Your major customer who's buying 68,000 has gone off and done their own RISC thing, and we're competing against TI trying to be the essentially the founder's support for that business. So it was very interesting on many fronts. There, in fact, at one point there was a company doing board level products named YARC, yet another RISC computer. So there were many, many computer architectures that people were trying to get to some level of mass.
So Melissa, in Only the Paranoid Survive, Andy Grove says, I'm quoting here, we had two very powerful chips that we were introducing at just about the same time. The 486, largely based on CISC technology and compatible with all PC software, and the IH60 based on RISC technology, which was very fast but compatible with nothing. We didn't know what to do, so we introduced both, figuring we'd let the marketplace decide. How did Intel, AD, and PR address this dichotomy? Did they?
The RISC was a defensive move, so we really didn't advertise it. It was out there if someone needed it, but the money followed the successful product line, which was the 386, 486. So yeah, I actually went back, I could not find anything at all. So it was a very low-key introduction.
So Andy speaks with forked tongue there. He didn't allow the customer to decide. You decided for the customer.
We were schizo about RISC and CISC. I think that's the best way to describe it. Remember, 1988, 1989, there is still no 32-bit software for the PC. Microsoft is working on this thing called NT, which later became Windows NT, which was originally targeted at our RISC chip and at the MIPS architecture. In fact, the NT came out of the N10, which was the code name for the 860. So here's Microsoft, Bill in particular, pushing this notion of RISC. And we don't know if we're going to be able to turn the customers over to 486 and whatever's next. So we were totally schizo about it. I think the turning moment came when, two turning moments. One is, Andy and I went to visit Steve Jobs at Next, and Steve said, I will not buy your RISC chip. So we switched gear like this and sold them the 486, told them to put his operating system, the Next OS, on the 486, and that worked. And the other one was HP. Everybody had selected a RISC architecture. Sun had their own, and Compaq was lined up with MIPS. HP was still making a make versus buy decision, and we were absolutely in the running. We lost that deal. They went with their own architecture, and after that, it was basically, you know, a little bit of business at Silicon Graphics, a little bit in the supercomputer business, but the whole thing just collapsed on its own.
The 860 only won very few designs, and they were in big scientific machines.
Big machines, yeah.
Okay, interesting insight. So now we come to the fourth phase, the third phase, beginning to address the consumers. Dave, when did Intel begin to see the end user as an important target audience? What prompted this insight?
Well, way back early, 1984, IBM introduces the IBM PC-AT. They had introduced in '81 the PC based on the 8088. The AT came out with the AT bus and with the 286. And Bill Gates and I were invited to go to the introduction back east, and I was invited to speak, and Bill wasn't invited to speak. And I come back and I have a one-on-one with Andy, and I'm pretty proud of the fact that the only non-Intel the only non-IBM employee to speak at that introduction was an Intel employee. And Andy turns to me and he says, but the people don't know that what makes the AT great is the 286. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, you got to make the people know. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, the case is the same, the power supply is the same, the memory's the same, the monitor's the same, the keyboard is the same. The thing that's different is I got a 286 and not an 886, and you got to make people know that. And I come back to my marketing department and I say, you won't believe what just happened in my one-on-one. Grove wants the end user to know the reason the AT is great is us and not IBM. And we got to figure out how to do that. And from there started to become sort of the nemesis of the ideas of how we talk to our customer's customer.
I need to add that on the PC-AT motherboard, we had 24 chips. So we had gotten everything in there except the memory, which we were no longer making by then. Everything was Intel in there. So clearly they could not have built this machine without our chips.
So Jack, at some point, did Motorola ratchet up the promotion to the end consumer?
Well, we had grown weary of Wall Street Journal ads. And it's kind of like running an airline. You can end up with no money very quick. But so Intel Inside was pretty well established. And we decided to do our own branding program. And we called it Powered by Motorola. And we got traction. We, in about the 1990 time frame, we had a customer celebration dinner around Powered by Motorola, and we actually ended up with about 300 people, 300 executives that joined us for that. But the thing that Motorola did that weakened that branding program is we applied it to all of the semiconductor products, and then because the brand had been so well identified, the corporation decided, hey, we could use Powered by Motorola on some of the other products that the company had. So it had no crisp identification in people's minds. Which kind of had it fade from a level of goodness or a value even, if I look back on it.
It might be worthwhile, at the risk of being nonlinear and jumping back, to talk a little bit about how this whole branding and consumer stuff happened, because it's not like one day, you know, Andy or Dave or somebody got out of bed on the wrong side and said, aha, let's brand. I think one of the seminal events was the launch of the compact Despro 386. They called, I think it was Dave, and asked for permission to put 386 in their product name, which I guess we said yes. What happened is after that, everybody, NEC, AT&T, IBM, you name them, they all had 386 in their product name. So we were looking at this and saying, wow, all our customers are putting our product name in there. We even ran an ad that said, you know, all the, something like Intense Competition has the way to bring out the best or whatever. And it had all 6 pictures of PCs and they all had 386 in their name. So that was sort of the first idea. Then came out the Red X campaign, which was fairly tactical in nature. The idea was kill the 286 ourselves and sell the 386 rather than let other companies. In fact, a competitor we haven't mentioned was IBM. IBM had reversed engineered the 286, put it in CMOS.
Actually designed it under a license from us, from our schematics.
It was legit, but they had a roadmap to have 286 to 20 megahertz, 24 megahertz, 28 megahertz until the year 2400. And so, you know, our goal was shoot the 286 now and do it ourselves before it gets established too much. So that was the Red X.
And
meanwhile,
that, manufacturing had developed these fab plants. We spent a lot of our cash to build these plants. We had them all ready to make 386s, and we needed the demand.
So that's sort of the start. You know, in the Red X, what it does is it does advertising and communication straight to the end users. Don't let your boss buy you one of those dog meat 286 PCs. You got to ask for a 386, right? Meanwhile, in Japan, we're running this thing called Intel Init, and it has a squirrel. Anytime somebody in Santa Clara says, why are you doing this? Bill Howe answers, It's Japan. You would not understand.
Japan is different.
Japan's different. You would not understand. So he does his thing, and we have the swirl with Intel in it in Ginza on top of a building is gigantic. Dennis Carter brings this ID back here and combines it with a program called the Computer Inside and starts telling the OEMs, okay, put that in your ads. Well, guess what? Nobody is biting. And so Dennis has the critical insight. We're going to give them some money in a co-op program. So when they run an ad with our name, bam, it goes out. And sort of, it took what, 5 years, 6 years to go through that process? And you know, it turns into direct communication to the end users. Oh, because guess what? The OEMs were not buying our chips as fast as we were making them. IBM was real pleased with the 286. Compaq was real pleased with the 386. No, I didn't do that. Then Dell became real pleased with the 486, but every time you're coming out with the next one, so how do you sell it? Well, go straight to the end user was the answer. Sorry, I took long, but no, I thought it was important to kind of
you've covered there's an Intel Inside actually appeared about 91, I think.
Correct.
Yes, it was 91 when we launched it. It's the year I was running marketing, I remember.
And how quickly did you begin to get feedback this was a worthwhile expenditure of hundreds of millions of dollars almost, right?
Actually, what we did is, classically, we would reduce the price of the microprocessor at any given speed about 30% a year due to semiconductor learning curve. And so every year at planning time, we would go to the customers and they would want a projection so they could do their business plan of what the price would be. And we were in a particularly good competitive state and we had a good manufacturing capability. And we decided that what we would do is instead of dropping it 30%, we just drop it 20% that year. And we would offer a rebate. And it was a 6% rebate of everything that you bought from us went into a marketing fund to pay 50% of the cost of advertisements that had the Intel Inside logo, that met certain specs, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, immediately the Asian manufacturers who had been begging us to be able to put Intel on their boxes somehow loved it. And so the third tier people just grabbed it right away. And then the second tier people came on board because they saw the beauty of the economics. 6% was a lot of the margins they were making on their boxes. And it was actually IBM and Compaq that were the last to surrender to the plan.
So it paid for itself, essentially.
Well, it was actually just part of the normal price reduction that we gave back in a different way. Because we had by that time we had a position that there was so much demand for the product we could do it.
By the way, the companies Dave just called the third tier are the only one left standing today.
That's right.
Okay, looking at some of the questions from the audience, I've actually built some of them into the earlier questions, but one I'm sure a number of people have addressed up here. I'll address it to Jack. Jack, you had the best processor, you had the best peripherals. Why did Intel win the IBM PC?
Well, so I've met dozens of people who claim to have made that decision, and I haven't figured out which one of them's not telling me the truth, I guess is probably a polite way to say it. But as I said, we had several generations of technology in the '79 timeframe. We had a product called the 6809 that did a great job on stack architectures, C, Pascal, and we had the 68000. And the 6809 was intended to be a 16-bit product bridging from the 8-bit space. And we didn't want to cannibalize that product, so we decided not to offer an 8-bit version of the 68000. And that was a big issue because it doubled the number of DRAMs you had to put in the PC. Now, that's the best anecdotal data I can give you back. Turned out later on, we went back and did an 8-bit version of the 68000 because we needed a low-end software product. And what we did is we did a bus rerun, and it cost us an 8-bit latch and 10 gates of logic to do that design. So it was not a technical problem. It was I don't want to overlap another product.
Well, I've talked to a number of the people that were at IBM and people, I don't know if Paul Indico's in the audience, he was our salesman there in Boca, and they all tell a consistent story that they were started out with an 8-bit machine, but they decided they couldn't their job was to beat the Apple II. And they couldn't beat the Apple II with with an 8-bit machine, So the Z80 went out the door, and then they started looking at 8086, Z8000, and 68000. Z8000 went out the door because Exxon was going into the office products business and had acquired Zilog, and so it got down to Motorola and Intel. And they were looking at the 8086, and to use the 8086, they needed to use all these new 16-bit peripherals that were quite expensive. The I/O chips, the timer counter, the parallel I/O, the UART, et cetera, and that was making them go over their cost target. Well, we had in Israel, our group had designed a shrink of the 8086 and put this 8-bit bus option in there without any conversation with marketing or management. But I'd been over to Haifa and I knew that it was in there, and we had put it on the die, but we'd never actually bonded it out. And so, in talking with Paul and the people in Florida, we said, well, what if we just bonded out that 8-bit bus version? Then we could sell them the 8-bit peripherals that go with the 8080 and 8085 that are second sourced by AMD, or David Laws was. We could offer a much lower package and it'd be widely second sourced. And we went in with that approach, and it turned out it hit their cost targets. Another thing that they said is that the 68,000 I/O chips were a little bit behind in terms of meeting their schedule, and so there was too much development risk associated with doing that. So it was sort of 8086. They liked the 68,000, but they liked our peripherals because they were further along. But then the idea of going to an 8-bit I/O bus and 8-bit peripherals, that was what cinched it.
Yeah. Jack, another IBM sort of related point here. How did the PowerPC chip come about, and what happened to it?
Well, PowerPC came about. So as we'd done the 88000, we'd done a bunch of work on application binary interfaces to create software. We put in a development team up in Redmond doing compilers for NT. Apple had signed on, and we just weren't getting critical mass. And IBM wanted to get more scale, and we ended up having a series of meetings. The 88000 wasn't taking us where we wanted to go, and we were having a series of meetings to figure out, as the marketplace compressed, who were the right ones to go after. Should we take Spark? There was a group of people that liked Spark. There were a group of people that liked MIPS, and then there were a group of people that liked IBM. And then Steve Jobs basically said, look, let's form this alliance, Apple, IBM, and Motorola, and we'll get the volume. We'll get the volume for the PowerPC, and we'll get it going. And our approach was, we were using these architectures not just in PC market, but we're using these architectures as SoCs in the embedded space. And so Motorola ended up negotiating enough degrees of freedom to go after the automotive market in addition. And so we changed horses roughly in the 1990 timeframe to PowerPC.
And PowerPC is no more. What happened?
PowerPC, well, one of the challenges with this business, if you don't have critical mass, you can't keep up on the R&D curve. And IBM didn't bring Motorola into the party so that Motorola could take care of Apple. Apple didn't totally want a second source just for continuity of supply. And at one point, IBM ended up, the ball went back and forth on different processor families. Motorola got more aggressive on pricing. The business wasn't as nice as it was. Freescale got spun out of Motorola with a lot of debt, and that was long after I left. But I just think the business played out a series of choices and decisions.
Fascinating. So, question here, I guess, for me, where did AMD fit in this story? Well, how long do we have? And Jerry Sanders always used to joke that Bob Noyce raised $5 million in 5 minutes, and he raised $50,000 in 5 months in starting a company. AMD did not have a lot of funding, and when the microprocessor business started to emerge, they looked to see where they could add most value. and initially decided to invest most of their treasure in a bipolar microprocessor family, the 2900 family, which became very, very successful. The company followed many of the same strategies as in the first phase here, with app notes and books and management pitches and everything else. AMD hung on to about 80% of that business over the years. I think at one point there were 20 second sources of the 2901, and everything, NMOS, gallium arsenide, silicon on sapphire, PMOS, all kinds of ECL, all kinds of flavors of bipolar. So that's where AMD really focused its engineering talent. On the realizing that MOS was going to be, it might be important one day, they did do their own version of the 8080. Generation ahead of Intel in technology. It was half the size and became a very profitable product for AMD for a while. But the next generation wasn't so obvious, and AMD, in fact, did sign a second source agreement with Zilog to produce the Z8000. That was sort of running into a few problems. The products weren't coming out from Zilog as fast as necessary. And of course, IBM came along demanding a second source for the 8088. And there was some kind of a phone call between Jerry Sanders and Andy Grove that both Dave and I would have loved to have been on the fly on the wall listening to that phone call, that ended up in AMD being a licensed second source for Intel on the 8088, 8086. I think that went as far forward as the 286. And of course, Intel's decision on the 386 just changed the whole shape of the business for AMD. I was involved mostly on the, as I said, on the bipolar side, and the rest is history. So I think we're just about running out of time here. There is one question from a member of the audience who would like to know what each of the panelists are doing today. Dave, would you like to fill us in? Tell us about your race car.
Racing cars, heli skiing, chairing the boarded brocade, managing the mountain winery in Saratoga. Just things like that.
What do you do in your spare time? Right?
Grow grapes, make wine.
Claude?
I started a solar electricity company 2 years ago, coming out of the simple realization that most of you don't want to buy panels, you want to buy electricity, so that's what we do, we sell power. We had this small issue known as the financial crisis. It's been a long, cold, dark winter, but finally the business is going, so that's what I do, and I race cars when I have time. But I'm not as fast as he is.
That's because you're in a Porsche and I'm in a Formula car.
I'm working as an executive director of a nonprofit part-time.
I'm still in the semiconductor business. I have been in the intellectual property business, a business without inventory. And I was at MIPS for a while, and now at Sonic, so it's a different model.
Great, thank you. So we've discussed the lasting changes the microprocessor wars had in high-tech marketing strategies, and I think have forever changed the way people take high-tech products to market. And it's very obvious today. We haven't been able to touch at all, of course, on the changes in communications and the effect of the internet and everything else on the business. That's probably a good topic for another session. If you want more details on some of the items that we've been discussing today, there's a considerable number of transcripts of oral histories that we've recorded here at the museum and outside over the last several years. There's the 4004, 8008, 8080,
4004, Z80, Z8000, 6800, 68,000,
32,000, AMD 2901. And the way to find those on the website is you just go to computerhistory.org/semiconductor. That'll take you to a timeline that we put together of about 50 milestones in computer history, in semiconductors in computer, the history of semiconductors in computers. And if you go to the 1971 timeline, click on that, it'll take you to a full page on the early days of microprocessors. And buried in the middle of that are links to all of these transcripts. I think you'll enjoy them, and there's lots more of the kinds of material that we've enjoyed today. So I'd like to thank the panelists for coming today, and hope you enjoyed the session.
Thanks very much. Let me add my thanks, David, for you being the moderator. Thanks to the panelists, and have a great day.
Good. Thanks, Brett.